Stalin's secret counterattack, the Soviet Blitzkrieg. No one expected. The frozen morning of December 5, 1941, marked a turning point that would reshape the entire course of the Second World War. While the world's attention remained fixated on the German Wehrmacht's seemingly unstoppable advance toward Moscow, deep within the Kremlin's fortified walls, Joseph Stalin was orchestrating what military historians would later describe as one of the most audacious counteroffensives in modern warfare. This was not merely a defensive reaction to Nazi aggression. This was a meticulously planned, overwhelmingly powerful Soviet blitzkrieg that Adolf Hitler and his generals never saw coming. For months, the German High Command had operated under a dangerous assumption. They believed the Red Army was broken, its reserves depleted, its leadership decapitated by Stalin's purges, and its industrial capacity crippled by the rapid German advance. Intelligence reports flooding into Berlin painted a picture of an empire on the verge of collapse. The Soviets, according to German estimates, had lost nearly 4 million men, thousands of tanks, and entire armies in the catastrophic opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Wehrmacht officers spoke confidently of celebrating Christmas in the Kremlin. Adolf Hitler himself had declared that the Soviet Union was finished, that it would never rise again. They were catastrophically wrong. What the Germans failed to comprehend was the sheer scale of Soviet deception and the iron will of Joseph Stalin. While the Wehrmacht celebrated what they believed were the death throes of the Red Army, Stalin had been quietly assembling the largest reserve force in military history. From the vast expanses of Siberia, from the mountains of Central Asia, from training grounds hidden deep in the Ural Mountains, an entirely new Soviet army was being born. These were not the poorly trained conscripts of the early war period. These were battle-hardened divisions from the Far East, elite troops who had faced the Japanese in border conflicts, fresh reserve armies equipped with new T-34 tanks, rolling off assembly lines that had been relocated beyond German reach. The scale of this mobilization was staggering. While German intelligence believed the Soviets had perhaps 20 divisions in reserve, Stalin had secretly concentrated over 100 fresh divisions around Moscow. More than 1 million men, 15,000 artillery pieces, 1,000 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft had been positioned in concealed locations around the capital. The entire operation had been conducted under the strictest secrecy. Troop movements occurred only at night. Radio silence was absolute. Entire armies moved through the winter darkness like ghosts, their presence unknown to German reconnaissance. General Georgy Zhukov, the man Stalin had appointed to defend Moscow, understood the gravity of the situation. The German Army Group Center stood just kilometers from the Soviet capital. German forward units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Panzer divisions had penetrated to within 30 kilometers of Moscow's city limits. The situation appeared desperate, and that was exactly what Zhukov wanted the Germans to believe. While German commanders counted their remaining kilometers to Moscow, Zhukov was counting his reserve divisions, waiting for the precise moment when the Wehrmacht would be at its most vulnerable. That moment arrived in late November 1941. The German advance had finally exhausted itself. Stretched supply lines, brutal winter conditions, and months of continuous combat had reduced Wehrmacht divisions to shadows of their former strength. Tanks sat immobilized, frozen solid in temperatures that plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, equipped only with summer uniforms, suffered from massive frostbite casualties. Fuel shortages meant that what mechanized equipment remained operational could barely move. The vaunted German war machine, which had conquered France in 6 weeks, was grinding to a halt in the frozen forests outside Moscow. Stalin recognized this window of opportunity with the ruthless clarity that characterized his strategic thinking. On December 5, 1941, he gave Zhukov the order that would change history. The Soviet counteroffensive would begin immediately, along a front stretching over 1,000 kilometers. This would not be a limited tactical counterattack. This would be a total war offensive, designed to annihilate Army Group Center and drive the Wehrmacht away from Moscow permanently. The attack erupted with a ferocity that shocked the German defenders. At precisely 3 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire along the entire front. The bombardment was unlike anything the Germans had experienced in the east. Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs by terrified German troops, filled the frozen air with their distinctive screaming sound. Thousands of artillery pieces pounded German positions that had been carefully mapped by Soviet reconnaissance. The bombardment continued for hours, turning defensive positions into cratered wastelands, severing communication lines and creating chaos throughout the German command structure. As the artillery fire lifted, the Red Army infantry surged forward. These were not the disorganized masses that German soldiers had fought in the summer. These were disciplined troops, many from Siberian divisions accustomed to winter warfare. They wore white winter camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the snow. They moved on skis through forests where German vehicles could not follow. They understood how to fight in conditions that paralyzed the Wehrmacht. Behind them came wave after wave of T-34 tanks, their wide treads specifically designed for winter conditions, their diesel engines far more reliable in extreme cold than the gasoline engines of German panzers. The German response was hampered at every level. Communication networks that had functioned efficiently during the summer advance now failed in the extreme cold. Orders from headquarters took hours to reach front-line units. German soldiers, weakened by frostbite and hunger, struggled to mount effective resistance. Weapons froze. Artillery pieces became immobile in the deep snow. Tanks refused to start, their engines seized by the cold. What defensive lines the Germans managed to establish were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and the ferocity of their assault. Within 48 hours, the Soviet offensive had achieved breakthrough along multiple sectors. German defensive positions that had taken weeks to construct were overrun in hours. Entire divisions found themselves encircled, cut off from supply and reinforcement. The Wehrmacht, which had spent months advancing eastward, was now retreating westward in disorder. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who had believed they were on the verge of final victory now faced the terrifying prospect of annihilation in the Russian winter. The architect of this Soviet success was not just Zhukov's tactical brilliance, but Stalin's strategic patience and brutal pragmatism. While Hitler had diverted forces to multiple objectives, attempting to capture Leningrad in the north and drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus in the south, Stalin had concentrated everything on the defense of Moscow. While Hitler had dismissed intelligence reports suggesting Soviet reserves were larger than estimated, Stalin had absorbed every detail about German positions, strength, and vulnerabilities. Where Hitler had allowed his ideology to cloud his military judgment, believing the Soviet Union would collapse from internal weaknesses, Stalin had recognized that the German army was overstretched, undersupplied, and vulnerable to a concentrated blow. The counteroffensive unfolded across multiple axes. In the north, Soviet forces struck at the 3rd and 4th Panzer Groups, which had been attempting to encircle Moscow from the north. The attack came from directions the Germans had not anticipated. Siberian ski troops emerged from forests, attacking supply lines and command posts. Tank brigades appeared where German intelligence had reported no Soviet armor. Within days, the Panzer Groups were in full retreat, abandoning equipment and positions they had fought for weeks to capture. In the center, Soviet armies targeted the 4th Army, the spearhead of the German advance on Moscow. This formation, which had come within sight of the Kremlin, now found itself fighting for survival. Soviet forces attacked from 3 sides simultaneously, threatening to encircle the entire army. The German commander, recognizing the desperate situation, requested permission to retreat. Hitler, from his headquarters far to the west, initially refused. He had issued his famous "Stand Fast" order, forbidding any retreat regardless of circumstances. This inflexibility would cost the Wehrmacht dearly. For 3 weeks, the Soviet offensive rolled westward. Town after town, captured by the Germans at great cost during the summer and autumn, was recaptured by the Red Army. Klin, Kalinin, Kaluga, and dozens of other locations were liberated in rapid succession. The front line, which in early December had been 30 kilometers from Moscow, was pushed back to distances of 100, then 150, then 200 kilometers. The immediate threat to the Soviet capital was eliminated. Moscow, which had been preparing for siege and street fighting, was saved. The human cost of this counteroffensive was immense on both sides. Soviet casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Stalin's approach to military operations had always been brutal in its disregard for human life, and the winter counteroffensive was no exception. Commanders were ordered to achieve objectives regardless of losses. Troops were sent forward in waves, sometimes poorly coordinated, absorbing enormous casualties to maintain the momentum of the offensive. Yet these losses, as terrible as they were, served Stalin's strategic purpose. Every day the offensive continued. The Wehrmacht was pushed further from Moscow, and the psychological balance of the war shifted. German losses were equally catastrophic, but far more consequential given the Wehrmacht's limited reserves. Entire divisions ceased to exist as fighting formations. Thousands of vehicles from tanks to trucks were abandoned in the retreat, either because they had broken down in the cold or because there was no fuel to operate them. Artillery pieces were lost. Small arms were discarded by freezing soldiers, desperate to lighten their loads during the retreat. More critically, the Wehrmacht lost something intangible but irreplaceable, the aura of invincibility that had carried it through Poland, France, and the Balkans. The intelligence failure that enabled this Soviet success was multifaceted and profound. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had fundamentally misunderstood Soviet capabilities. Their estimates of Soviet industrial production were wildly inaccurate. They had not grasped the significance of the Soviet decision to relocate entire factories eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. These factories, reassembled in the Urals and Siberia, were producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition at rates the Germans could not match. The Soviets were manufacturing more T-34 tanks in a single month than Germany produced panzers in an entire year. Furthermore, German intelligence had failed to detect the massive troop movements from the Soviet Far East. Following intelligence reports that Japan was planning to strike south toward the Pacific rather than north toward Siberia, Stalin had made the calculated decision to strip the Far Eastern military district of most of its strength. Entire armies were loaded onto trains and transported across the breadth of the Soviet Union to the Moscow front. This operation involved moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tons of equipment over 6,000 kilometers. It should have been impossible to hide, yet German intelligence detected nothing. The reasons for this intelligence failure were numerous. German racial ideology had led them to underestimate Soviet capabilities systematically. Nazi doctrine held that Slavic peoples were inferior, incapable of the organizational sophistication required for modern warfare. This prejudice blinded German analysts to evidence that contradicted their assumptions. When reconnaissance flights reported unusual rail activity, the reports were dismissed. When agents reported rumors of massive troop concentrations, the information was discounted. The Germans saw what they expected to see, a broken enemy on the verge of collapse. Soviet operational security, by contrast, was exceptional. Stalin had learned from the failures of the Finnish Winter War, where poor coordination and security had cost Soviet forces dearly. For the Moscow counteroffensive, every detail was controlled. Troop movements occurred only at night and under strict radio silence. Units were assembled in forests and other concealed locations. Reconnaissance was conducted aggressively to ensure German observation posts and aircraft could not detect the buildup. Disinformation was spread through channels the Soviets knew were compromised, feeding German intelligence false information that confirmed their existing biases. The winter conditions themselves became a Soviet weapon. The Red Army had prepared for winter warfare in ways the Wehrmacht had not. Soviet soldiers received proper winter uniforms, including felt boots and quilted jackets. Soviet vehicles were winterized, with appropriate lubricants and antifreeze. Soviet tactics were adapted to snow and cold, emphasizing mobility through forests on skis and emphasizing night operations when German observation was most limited. The Germans, by contrast, suffered terribly. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in many units. Equipment failure rates soared. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they had been sent into battle unprepared for the realities they faced. As December turned to January, the Soviet offensive continued to build momentum. Stalin, encouraged by the initial successes, expanded the objectives. What had begun as an operation to push the Germans away from Moscow evolved into a broader campaign to encircle and destroy Army Group Center entirely. New offensives were launched north and south of the main Moscow axis. Soviet forces attempted to cut off the German salient around Vyazma, where tens of thousands of Wehrmacht troops were potentially vulnerable to encirclement. These expanded objectives, however, revealed the limits of Soviet capabilities. While the Red Army had successfully concentrated overwhelming force for the initial counteroffensive, sustaining operations across multiple axes strained Soviet logistics. Ammunition supplies dwindled, fuel became scarce. The same winter conditions that had paralyzed the Germans now began to hamper Soviet operations. Troops advancing rapidly westward outran their supply lines. Artillery support diminished as ammunition could not be brought forward quickly enough. The offensive began to lose its coherence. German forces, despite their desperate situation, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Hitler's stand-fast order, while tactically questionable in many situations, did prevent the retreat from becoming a complete rout. German units formed defensive hedgehogs in major towns, forcing Soviet forces to fight for every position. Luftwaffe transport aircraft, flying in desperate conditions, managed to supply some encircled positions. German combat engineers proved adept at improvising defensive positions even in frozen ground. The Wehrmacht was battered and bloodied, but it was not destroyed. By late January 1942, the Soviet offensive had achieved significant but not decisive results. The Germans had been pushed back from Moscow by distances ranging from 100 to 250 kilometers. Army Group Center had suffered approximately one-third casualties. Dozens of towns and cities had been liberated, but the Wehrmacht had not been destroyed. The front had stabilized along a new line, still deep inside Soviet territory. The war would continue for more than 3 years, yet the psychological and strategic implications of the Moscow counteroffensive extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been defeated in a major campaign. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Soviet morale, which had been devastated by the disasters of the summer and autumn, rebounded dramatically. The Red Army had proven it could not only resist the Wehrmacht, but could defeat it decisively. Stalin's position, which had been precarious in the darkest days of October when German forces approached Moscow, was now secure. The Soviet system, which many had predicted would collapse under the strain of war, had demonstrated unexpected resilience and power. Internationally, the implications were equally profound. The Soviet Union's survival and its ability to launch successful counteroffensives altered the entire strategic calculation of the war. Britain, which had been fighting alone against Nazi Germany, now had a powerful ally that was actively engaging the bulk of German military strength. The United States, which had just entered the war following Pearl Harbor, could now plan its strategy, knowing that Germany faced a genuine two-front war. The balance of power had shifted fundamentally. The counteroffensive also revealed the true nature of the war on the Eastern Front. This would not be a quick campaign decided in months. This would be a grinding war of attrition fought across a vast territory under brutal conditions. Victory would go not to the side with the most brilliant generals or the best individual soldiers, but to the side that could mobilize greater resources, sustain higher casualties, and maintain the will to continue fighting. These were areas where the Soviet system, for all its inefficiencies and brutalities, held significant advantages. Stalin himself drew important lessons from the counteroffensive. He had learned the value of operational deception and surprise. He had seen that concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points could achieve dramatic results. He had also learned the limits of such operations and the dangers of overextension. These lessons would inform Soviet strategy throughout the remainder of the war. The great Soviet offensives of 1943, 1944, and 1945 would all reflect the operational principles first demonstrated outside Moscow in December 1941. Careful preparation, absolute secrecy, concentration of force, and ruthless exploitation of success. For the German military, the failure at Moscow and the success of the Soviet counteroffensive created a crisis that reverberated throughout the remainder of the war. Hitler, furious at his generals for what he perceived as their failures, began to micromanage military operations in ways that proved increasingly disastrous. Experienced field commanders were dismissed. Hitler increasingly relied on his own judgment, overruling professional military advice. The flexibility and initiative that had characterized German operations in the early war years gave way to rigid adherence to Hitler's directives, regardless of tactical realities. The logistical lessons of the Moscow campaign were largely ignored by German high command. Despite the catastrophic impact of supply shortages, inadequate winter preparation, and overstretched lines of communication, the Wehrmacht would repeat these mistakes in subsequent campaigns. The drive toward Stalingrad in 1942 would see German forces again advancing to the limits of their logistical capabilities, again underestimating Soviet reserves, and again suffering devastating counteroffensives. The pattern established at Moscow would be repeated, with increasingly disastrous results for German arms. The Soviet counteroffensive also demonstrated Stalin's willingness to accept enormous casualties to achieve strategic objectives. The human cost of the December 1941 to January 1942 operations was staggering. Soviet sources, which typically understated casualties, acknowledged losses exceeding 300,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The true figure was likely significantly higher. Entire divisions were ground down to fractions of their strength, yet Stalin viewed these losses as acceptable. In his calculus, preserving the Soviet state and defeating Nazi Germany justified any level of sacrifice. This brutal logic would characterize Soviet operations throughout the war. The winter counteroffensive created heroes who would become legendary in Soviet military history. General Zhukov, already respected, emerged as the savior of Moscow. He would go on to command successful operations at Stalingrad, Kursk, and eventually the assault on Berlin. Other commanders, including Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Konev, gained experience and reputation during the Moscow fighting that would carry them to the highest ranks of Soviet military leadership. These men, tempered in the desperate fighting of 1941, would become the architects of Soviet victory. The propaganda value of the counteroffensive was immense and was exploited fully by Soviet media. After months of defeats and withdrawals, the Soviet people finally had a genuine victory to celebrate. Newspapers ran triumphant headlines. Newsreels showed Soviet soldiers advancing westward, liberating towns, capturing German prisoners. The message was clear. The Red Army was not defeated. The German invaders could be beaten. Victory was possible. This propaganda served a crucial purpose in maintaining popular support for the war effort and justifying the enormous sacrifices demanded of the Soviet population. German propaganda, conversely, struggled to explain how an enemy they had described as defeated and broken had launched such a powerful offensive. Initial German reports minimized the scale of the Soviet counteroffensive, describing it as local attacks that had been contained. As the extent of the German retreat became impossible to hide, propaganda shifted to blaming the winter weather rather than Soviet military prowess. German soldiers, according to this narrative, had not been defeated by the Red Army, but by General Winter. This narrative, while self-serving, contained an element of truth, but obscured the more fundamental reality. The Wehrmacht had been outfought, outmaneuvered, and decisively defeated by an enemy it had underestimated. The technological aspects of the counteroffensive also deserve attention. The superiority of certain Soviet equipment, particularly the T-34 tank and the Katyusha rocket launcher, became apparent during the winter fighting. The T-34, with its sloped armor, powerful gun, and excellent mobility, proved superior to most German tanks in direct combat. The Katyusha, while less accurate than conventional artillery, provided devastating area fire that had profound psychological effects on German troops. Soviet willingness to innovate and adapt militarily contrasted with German tendencies to rely on established doctrine and equipment. As winter gave way to spring in 1942, both sides paused to reorganize and prepare for renewed campaigning. The front line had stabilized, but it had stabilized far from Moscow. The immediate threat to the Soviet capital had been eliminated permanently. Germany would never again come so close to capturing the city. The strategic initiative had shifted, not decisively, but perceptibly. Germany was now forced to consider not just how to achieve victory, but how to avoid defeat. The Soviet Union, having survived the most dangerous period of the war, could now contemplate not just resistance, but eventual victory. The Moscow counteroffensive had not won the war. 3.5 more years of brutal fighting lay ahead. Millions more would die. Cities would be destroyed. Entire populations would be displaced. The suffering was far from over. But December 1941 marked the point where German defeat became possible, where Soviet victory became conceivable. The secret counterattack that no one expected had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Second World War. In military academies around the world, the Moscow counteroffensive is studied as a masterpiece of operational art. The combination of strategic deception, operational concentration, tactical surprise, and ruthless exploitation represents warfare at its highest level. The operation demonstrated that mass properly employed and concentrated can overcome tactical superiority. It showed that morale and willingness to sacrifice can compensate for material disadvantages. It proved that underestimating an opponent, particularly based on ideological prejudice rather than objective analysis, invites disaster. For Joseph Stalin personally, the counteroffensive represented vindication. His decision to remain in Moscow when many urged evacuation had been correct. His insistence on defending the capital, rather than trading space for time, had succeeded. His brutal purges of the Red Army officer corps in the late 1930s, which many blamed for Soviet defeats in 1941, had been survived. The military leaders who remained, forged in the fires of the purges and the desperate fighting of 1941, had proven capable of defeating the Germans. Stalin's position as supreme leader was now unassailable. He would rule the Soviet Union until his death in 1953, and his legacy would forever include his leadership during the Great Patriotic War. The counteroffensive also illustrated the unique characteristics of Soviet military culture. The Red Army's willingness to accept casualties that would have been considered intolerable by Western armies enabled operations on a scale unimaginable elsewhere. The Soviet system's ability to mobilize resources, relocate industries, and conscript manpower created military potential that Germany could not match, despite its technological and tactical superiorities. The ideological commitment of many Soviet soldiers, fighting to defend their homeland from invasion, provided motivation that compensated for deficiencies in training and equipment. As news of the Soviet counteroffensive spread internationally, reactions varied. In Britain, where the Soviet entry into the war had created an unlikely alliance between Churchill's government and Stalin's regime, the news was greeted with genuine relief and celebration. The pressure on Britain, which had been bearing the brunt of fighting Germany, was significantly reduced. British planners could now assume that Germany would be forced to maintain the majority of its military strength on the Eastern Front, reducing the threat of invasion and making eventual Allied victory more plausible. In the United States, which had just entered the war, the Soviet counteroffensive shaped strategic planning. American military leaders recognized that Germany was fully committed in the East and that this commitment created opportunities for Allied operations in other theaters. The decision to prioritize the European theater over the Pacific, enshrined in the Germany First strategy, was reinforced by evidence that Germany could be defeated and that the Soviet Union would be a major contributor to that defeat. In occupied Europe, resistance movements drew hope from Soviet success. If the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht could be beaten in Russia, perhaps Nazi control was not permanent. Underground newspapers circulated stories of Soviet victories. Sabotage increased. The psychology of occupation began to shift subtly but significantly. In neutral countries, particularly Turkey and Japan, the Soviet counteroffensive prompted reassessments of strategic positions. Turkey, which had been considering entry into the war on the Axis side, maintained its neutrality. Japan, which had been contemplating attacks north into Siberia, confirmed its decision to strike south into the Pacific instead. These decisions, influenced by Soviet demonstrations of military power, shaped the broader course of the war. The December 1941 counteroffensive was not perfect. Soviet casualties were excessive, even by the brutal standards of the Eastern Front. Many operational objectives were not achieved. Army Group Center, though battered, was not destroyed. The broader strategic situation remained precarious, with vast territories under German occupation and Soviet industrial capacity still rebuilding. But perfection was not necessary. What was necessary was survival, demonstration of capability, and shifting of momentum. These objectives were achieved decisively. In the frozen forests outside Moscow in December 1941, the course of the 20th century was altered. The Soviet Blitzkrieg that no one expected announced to the world that Nazi Germany could be defeated, that the Red Army was a formidable fighting force, and that the Second World War would not end with Axis victory. The secret counterattack had succeeded beyond even Stalin's expectations. The long road to Berlin had begun, starting with those frigid December days when Soviet soldiers surged forward through the snow, driving the Wehrmacht westward, liberating Soviet territory, and writing one of the most remarkable chapters in military history. The legacy of this operation extends beyond World War II. The principles of operational security, concentration of force, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses demonstrated at Moscow influenced military thinking throughout the Cold War and into the present day. The operation demonstrated that even seemingly hopeless situations can be reversed through careful planning, deception, and willingness to accept risk. It showed that wars are decided not by initial advantages, but by sustained effort, adaptability, and national will. For the soldiers who fought in those terrible conditions, whether Soviet or German, the Moscow counteroffensive was an experience of unimaginable hardship. Men fought in temperatures that froze flesh in minutes. They endured hunger, exhaustion, fear, and wounds in conditions where medical care was rudimentary at best. Many died, their bodies lost in the snow, their sacrifices remembered only in the aggregate statistics of military history. Their individual stories, the specific moments of courage or terror or simple survival, are largely lost to history. Yet collectively, they created one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century. The counteroffensive demonstrated that World War II in the East was fundamentally different from the war in the West. This was total war on an unprecedented scale, fought with an intensity and brutality that exceeded anything seen on other fronts. The casualties suffered in a single day's fighting outside Moscow exceeded the casualties many Western armies suffered in entire campaigns. The geographic scope, the environmental extremes, the ideological hatred that fueled both sides, all these factors combined to create a conflict unique in human history. Stalin's secret counterattack, the Soviet Blitzkrieg that no one expected, stands as testament to the decisive role of strategic surprise in warfare. Despite possessing superior technology, better trained soldiers, and more experienced commanders, Germany was defeated at Moscow because the Soviets achieved something the Germans had not anticipated was possible: the concentration of overwhelming force at the decisive point at the decisive time. This is the essence of military art, and in December 1941, the Red Army achieved it masterfully. The snow-covered fields outside Moscow, where men fought and died in December 1941, are quiet now. Memorials mark some battle sites. Farmers work the land. Life has returned to normal, but the ghosts of that terrible winter remain in the historical record, in the memories of survivors, and in the impact those events had on the world. The counteroffensive that saved Moscow, that stopped the Wehrmacht, that began the long march to Berlin, this was Stalin's secret, the Blitzkrieg no one expected, the operation that changed the war, and thereby changed history itself.